Michael sat at the bus stop under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, his tired frame hunched over, a thermos of coffee cradled in his calloused hands. His rugged work clothes, faded by countless hours of labor, bore testament to a life lived on the edge of survival. He wasn't thinking about the Marine Corps days. Those were lifetimes ago. Now, the battlefields had shifted to construction sites and a never-ending war with bills. As he stared into the darkness, the night stillness was broken by muffled shouting. Down the block, two men were arguing loudly, their voices carrying over the empty street. Michael tensed, his instincts sharpening, years of training whispering warnings. He scanned the scene but stayed seated. Trouble wasn't his to claim tonight. A car rolled to a stop in front of him, its headlights momentarily blinding. The window lowered, revealing a man in his late 40s with a slick smile and an air of condescension. "Hey there, need a ride? Or are you just waiting for something you can't afford?" the man sneered. Michael clenched his jaw but didn't respond. He had encountered this type before, people who equated worn clothes with weakness. As the car sped off with laughter trailing behind, Michael exhaled sharply, returning his gaze to the empty road. Moments later, a police cruiser pulled up. Two officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their belts. "Sir, you can't loiter here," one of them said curtly, their tone heavy with suspicion. "I'm waiting for a bus," Michael replied evenly, though he felt the weight of their eyes examining him like a problem to be solved. "Where's your ID?" the second officer asked, stepping closer. Michael slowly reached into his pocket and handed over his driver's license, his movements deliberate. The officer scrutinized it, then stared at Michael, as if expecting a different narrative than the one on the plastic card. "Ex-Marine, huh? What's a guy like you doing out here?" the first cop asked, their skepticism barely masked. "Just heading home," Michael said, keeping his voice calm despite the irritation bubbling under the surface. After a prolonged silence, the officers returned his ID and left, their suspicion hanging in the air like smog. Michael watched them drive away, his fists tightening briefly before relaxing. The bus arrived late, its brakes screeching in protest. Michael stepped aboard, nodding at the weary driver. As he made his way to a seat, a young woman caught his attention. She was sitting near the back, her hoodie pulled up, glancing around nervously. Something about her demeanor set Michael on edge. The bus rattled to life, its engine groaning as it merged back onto the road. A few stops later, the woman suddenly stood, pulling a small blade from her pocket. Her hands trembled as she shouted at the other passengers to hand over their wallets. Fear rippled through the cramped space, but Michael's training kicked in. "Hey!" he barked, his voice cutting through the panic. The woman's eyes snapped to him, her grip on the knife tightening. "You don't want to do this," he said, rising slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. "Put the knife down." "Stay back," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I just need the money, okay? I don't want to hurt anyone." Michael took a step closer, his eyes locking with hers. "I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel like you've got no way out. But this isn't it." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't lower the knife. The bus driver had already radioed for help, and the faint wail of sirens grew louder in the distance. Michael could see her panic escalating. "They're coming," he said softly. "But you don't have to go down like this. Just hand me the knife." The woman hesitated, her gaze darting to the approaching police lights outside. Finally, with a shaky exhale, she dropped the blade into Michael's waiting hand. The bus came to a stop, and the officers boarded swiftly, taking her into custody without incident. As they escorted her away, she turned to Michael. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the commotion. Michael sat back down, exhaustion settling in anew. The bus continued its journey, the passengers murmuring quietly about what had just transpired. For Michael, it was another reminder of the weight he carried, not just from his past, but from the world around him. The bus jolted to a stop at a station near Michael's apartment complex. As he stepped off, the cool night air nipped at his face, but it wasn't unwelcome. He glanced at the quiet street ahead, eager to get home and put the day behind him. However, his solace was short-lived. A group of young men leaned against a nearby lamppost, their voices carrying loud laughter and vulgar jokes. Michael didn't pay them much attention, they were just kids killing time. But as he walked past, their voices hushed briefly before one of them called out, "Hey, old man. You drop out of the war zone and land here?" Michael didn't break stride, pretending not to hear. He had no energy for this nonsense. "Yo, I'm talking to you," the voice persisted, louder this time. He sighed and turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of the speaker, a lanky young man with a sharp jawline and a cocky smirk. His friends stood close, their postures brimming with arrogance. "Leave me alone," Michael said firmly and kept walking. But they weren't done. "Whoa, you got an attitude for a guy who looks like he just crawled out of a sewer," another, heavier-built man jeered. "You smell like it too." The group cackled, their laughter echoing down the empty street. Michael clenched his fists, not out of anger but out of restraint. He'd seen enough combat to know how quickly escalation could ruin lives. "Hey, don't ignore us," shouted Jason, the apparent leader. He walked briskly to catch up with Michael and shoved him hard on the shoulder. "We're just trying to be friendly, Grandpa." Michael stumbled but quickly caught his balance. His body tensed. He turned slowly, fixing Jason with a glare sharp enough to cut steel. "I said, leave me alone," Michael repeated, his voice calm but laced with a dangerous undertone. Jason didn't back down. If anything, his smirk widened. "Or what? You gonna call your buddies from the nursing home to come help?" The others roared with laughter, emboldened by Jason's bravado. Alex, a wiry guy with a tattoo snaking up his neck, stepped closer. "Yo, check out this dude's hands," he said mockingly. "What's the matter, old-timer? Too much work break your fingers?" Trevor, the quietest of the group so far, chimed in with a sneer. "Nah, man, those are combat hands. He probably used to be some war hero or something. Ain't that right, Sergeant Nobody?" Michael could feel the heat rising in his chest. He wasn't ashamed of his scars or his calloused hands. They were badges of a life spent working hard and fighting for something bigger than himself. But the mocking tone stung nonetheless. Then Zach, a tall guy with a shaved head, added the words that pushed everything too far. "Or maybe he's just some washed-up junkie. You know how those people are?" The racial slur that followed burned like acid in the air. Michael's jaw tightened, his breath steadying in the way it always had before a fight. Jason stepped in again, emboldened by his friends. He shoved Michael harder this time, nearly knocking him into the gutter. "What's the matter, huh? Cat got your tongue? Or are you too scared to fight back?" Michael straightened himself, his eyes cold as ice. "I'm not scared of you," he said, his voice low but firm. Jason laughed. Big words for a guy who's one bad push away from breaking a hip. Michael didn't flinch as Jason raised a hand to push him again. This time, Michael moved. His grip was like iron as he caught Jason's wrist midair and twisted it just enough to send pain shooting up the younger man's arm. Jason yelped, and the cocky grin vanished from his face. "Let me go, you psycho!" Jason yelled, squirming to free himself. Michael released him with a sharp shove, sending Jason stumbling backward into his friends. The group's laughter died immediately, replaced by a tense, charged silence. Alex stepped forward, his bravado faltering slightly as he saw the quiet storm brewing in Michael's eyes. "Hey, man, we don't want no trouble. Just messing around, you know? Does it look like I'm in the mood to play games?" Michael asked coldly. Trevor and Zach exchanged nervous glances, but Jason wasn't done. Humiliation burned on his face, and he spat on the ground near Michael's boots. "You think you're tough, huh? You think you can scare us just because you're some old war dog?" Michael stared him down, his posture calm but unyielding. "No," he said simply. "But I'll warn you once, don't test me." The quiet intensity in his voice seemed to finally penetrate the group's bravado. Even Jason faltered under the weight of Michael's gaze. The young men muttered to each other, their earlier confidence unraveling. "Whatever, man," Jason finally said, his voice laced with false bravado. "You're not worth it." He spat again, then turned and stalked off, his friends trailing behind him like a pack of defeated wolves. Michael watched them disappear into the night, his heart pounding harder than he cared to admit. He hadn't wanted a fight, but some battles found you whether you wanted them or not. The street was quiet again, save for the hum of distant traffic. Michael adjusted his jacket and continued walking, the shadows of his past and present swirling around him like ghosts. Michael continued walking, his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of the young men doubling back. The streets were silent except for the occasional sound of a distant car. He hoped the confrontation was over, but years of experience had taught him that people like Jason didn't let things go easily. He turned the corner into a narrower, dimly lit street that cut through the neighborhood. The air felt heavier here, oppressive even, and his gut told him something was off. Sure enough, footsteps echoed behind him, several pairs. He didn't react at first, maintaining his steady pace. "Hey, old man." Jason's voice rang out again, this time filled with malice. Michael sighed, stopping in his tracks. Slowly he turned around. Jason and his friends were there, their earlier smirks now replaced with something darker. Jason held a metal pipe, and Alex had a chain wrapped around his hand. Trevor and Zach flanked them, their postures tense and aggressive. "Didn't think you'd just walk away from us, did you?" Jason said, twirling the pipe menacingly. Michael remained calm, his stance neutral but poised. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice even but carrying an edge of warning. Jason sneered. "What, you think you're better than us? You think you can just embarrass me and get away with it?" "You embarrassed yourself," Michael replied simply. The comment struck a nerve, and Jason lunged forward, swinging the pipe. Michael sidestepped with practiced ease, his reflexes honed from years of training. Before Jason could recover, Michael grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply and forcing him to drop the weapon. Jason cried out, but before Michael could release him, Alex charged in with the chain. Michael let go of Jason, ducking under the swinging chain and stepping into Alex's space. A quick, controlled strike to Alex's gut sent him stumbling backward, gasping for air. Trevor and Zach hesitated for a moment, clearly reconsidering their decision. But Jason, fueled by rage and humiliation, screamed, "Get him!" Trevor came at Michael from the side, throwing a clumsy punch. Michael blocked it effortlessly, gripping Trevor's arm and using his momentum to spin him around. A light shove sent Trevor crashing into Zach, who had just started his approach. "Stop this," Michael said, his voice steady but commanding. "Before someone gets hurt." But Jason wasn't listening. He lunged again, his fists swinging wildly. Michael deflected each blow with precision, his movements economical and fluid. He landed a controlled punch to Jason's shoulder, not enough to injure but enough to stagger him. Alex, recovered from the gut strike, came at him again, swinging the chain like a whip. Michael sidestepped once more, grabbing the chain mid-swing and yanking it out of Alex's grasp. He tossed it to the side, his eyes locking on Alex with a calm intensity that made the younger man freeze in place. "Enough," Michael said, his voice low but resonant. "This isn't a fight you can win." Jason, however, was beyond reason. He picked up the pipe again and charged, roaring like a wounded animal. This time, Michael didn't hold back. With a swift kick, he sent the pipe clattering across the pavement. He followed it up with a series of precise movements, disarming Jason completely and pinning him against a nearby wall. Jason struggled, but Michael's grip was unyielding. "Listen to me," Michael said, his voice cold and unwavering. "You don't know who you're messing with and you don't want to find out. Walk away while you still can." Jason's bravado crumbled under Michael's stare. He nodded shakily, and Michael released him, stepping back. "Take your friends and go home," Michael said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jason stumbled away, clutching his bruised wrist. Alex and Trevor helped him to his feet, their earlier confidence replaced by a subdued fear. As they retreated into the shadows, Jason turned back briefly, his voice trembling with both anger and shame. "This isn't over, old man." Michael didn't respond. He stood there until they disappeared into the night, his body still tense, his senses still sharp. Only when he was certain they were gone did he relax, the adrenaline slowly fading. He turned back toward his apartment, his steps measured and deliberate. He knew he had done the right thing by neutralizing the threat without causing serious harm, but the weight of the encounter lingered. The humiliation, the racism, the senseless aggression, It was a stark reminder of the darkness that still existed in the world, a darkness he couldn't escape no matter how far he tried to move from his past. When he finally reached his apartment, the night felt quieter, almost unnervingly so. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. For a moment, he stood there, staring into the dimly lit room. Then, with a weary sigh, he moved to the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water. Michael knew this wasn't the end of it. People like Jason didn't let things go easily, and trouble had a way of finding him no matter how hard he tried to avoid it. But for now, he was safe, and that was enough. Michael sat at the small table in his apartment, the morning light spilling through the window. His knuckles bore faint marks from the scuffle the night before, but his mind wasn't on the bruises. He stared into his coffee, the bitterness matching the taste of the night's events still lingering in his mouth. The quiet was deceptive. He knew it wouldn't last. The peace was broken by a knock at the door, sharp and insistent. Michael's shoulders tensed. He rose slowly, his instincts telling him to brace for more trouble. When he opened the door, Jason stood there, flanked by Alex and Zach. Jason's face was a mask of anger, but his swollen wrist betrayed the fallout from their confrontation. "What do you want?" Michael asked, his voice low and steady. Jason stepped forward, his chin jutting out in defiance. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh? Just 'cause you got the drop on us last night?" Michael leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "Oh, I think I'm someone who didn't want to hurt a bunch of kids who don't know when to walk away." Jason's friends exchanged uneasy glances, but Jason pressed on. "You humiliated me in front of my crew. You think I'm just gonna let that slide?" Michael sighed. "You came after me, Jason. I warned you to back off, but you didn't listen. That's on you." The calmness in Michael's tone seemed to enrage Jason further. He pointed a finger at Michael, his voice rising. "You don't know who you're messing with. People like you don't get to talk down to me. I'm not some washed-up nobody like you." There it was again, that venomous edge, laced with racism and disdain. Michael's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He could feel the weight of their hostility pressing against him, but he refused to let it ignite the spark they were so clearly hoping for. "You've got a lot of anger," Michael said, his voice quiet but firm. "But the person you're really mad at isn't me." Jason sneered. "Oh, don't give me that psychobabble crap. You don't know anything about me." Michael met his gaze steadily. "I know you're looking for someone to blame for the things in your life you don't like. I've been there. But picking fights with strangers isn't going to fix any of it." Jason opened his mouth to retort, but Alex cut in. "Yo man, maybe we should just go. This guy's not worth it." Jason rounded on him. "You're taking his side now?" "No," Alex muttered, looking away. "I'm just saying maybe he's right. We messed up last night." Jason's face darkened, his pride wounded by his friend's words. He turned back to Michael. "You think you're better than me? Sitting here in this dump, acting like some kind of wise old man? You're nothing." Michael stepped closer, his posture relaxed but his presence commanding. "You're right, Jason. I'm no one special. I work hard, I pay my bills, and I try to keep my head down. But last night you forced my hand. And even then, I didn't hurt you. You know why?" Jason scoffed, but his bravado was thinning. "Because you're scared?" "No," Michael said evenly. "Because I've seen what happens when people lose control. It doesn't just ruin one life, it ruins many. I didn't want to ruin yours." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. For a moment, Jason's defiance faltered. "You've got a choice," Michael continued, his voice steady. "You can keep coming after me, trying to prove something to yourself or your friends. Or you can step back, take a good look at where this road leads, and choose something better." Jason's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he didn't move. His face twisted with frustration, humiliation, and something else, something like doubt. "You think you're some kind of saint?" Jason spat. "Preaching about choices like you're better than me?" Michael shook his head. "I'm not better than you. I've made plenty of mistakes. But I learned from them. That's the difference." Behind Jason, Alex, and Zach shifted uncomfortably. It was clear they were no longer interested in backing their leader's vendetta. "Come on, man," Zach muttered. "This is stupid." Jason glared at him, but the fight was draining from his posture. He looked back at Michael, his expression a mix of anger and uncertainty. "You're lucky I don't finish this," Jason said, though his voice lacked conviction. Michael didn't rise to the bait. "You can walk away now, Jason. No one's stopping you." For a tense moment, it seemed like Jason might lash out again. But then he stepped back, shaking his head in frustration. "Let's go," he barked at his friends, turning on his heel. Alex and Zach followed him, their relief palpable. As they disappeared down the hallway, Michael closed the door, exhaling deeply. He leaned against the door, his thoughts racing. He hadn't wanted to fight, but the confrontation had been unavoidable. Yet, even as the tension began to ebb, he knew the encounter wasn't just about him. Jason was carrying something heavy, and his anger was a symptom of that weight. Michael hoped his words had planted a seed. He didn't expect a miraculous transformation, but maybe, just maybe, Jason would think twice the next time he felt the urge to lash out. As Michael sat back down, the apartment fell into silence once more. He picked up his coffee, now cold, and took a sip. It was bitter, but it grounded him. Life wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about facing it with dignity, about finding strength in restraint and power in peace. And for Michael, that was a lesson worth living, no matter how many times the world tested him. The walk home was quiet, the streets lit by the soft glow of streetlights, their orange hue casting long shadows. Michael walked slowly, his hands in his pockets, the chill of the evening air biting at his face. His breath puffed out in small clouds as he made his way down the familiar route. He was tired, not just from the confrontation, but from the memories it dredged up. Michael thought back to the days when he was younger, greener, and filled with fire. As a Marine, he had learned discipline and control, lessons forged in the crucible of war. But he had also seen what unchecked anger and hatred could do, how it could tear apart lives and leave scars that time could never truly heal. Jason's face flickered in his mind, a younger version of the anger Michael had once seen in his comrades and in himself. That anger, if left unchecked, had the power to destroy more than just its target. It could consume the one holding it like a flame-devouring fuel. He stopped at a crosswalk, the silence broken by the distant sound of sirens. He watched as the light turned green, and a car passed, its driver glancing at him before quickly looking away. The small gesture triggered a memory. He was back in uniform, walking through a small town overseas. The people there had looked at him the same way, as if he were a problem to be avoided, a walking symbol of something they couldn't trust. He hadn't understood it then, but now he did. Perceptions were powerful, and breaking through them required more than strength. It required patience, understanding, and respect. Michael resumed walking, his boots scuffing softly against the pavement. Respect. That word carried a weight he hadn't appreciated when he was Jason's age. Back then, respect was something demanded, taken, not earned. It took years, and a lot of mistakes, for him to understand the difference. He thought of the confrontation earlier, the tension thickened by Jason's venomous words and actions. Michael had heard those slurs before, directed at him and others, used as weapons to humiliate and dehumanize. He knew their power to cut deeper than fists. Yet, tonight he had chosen not to let them win. Not because he was above the pain, but because he had learned that reacting with violence only validated the hate behind them. It was a lesson hard-learned, one he wished he could impart to Jason and his friends. He crossed another intersection, the faint hum of a streetlight overhead buzzing like a distant memory. He thought about the young men, Jason, Alex, Zach, how they had followed Jason's lead, their confidence crumbling when challenged. It reminded him of his own days in a squad, how the group could amplify both courage and recklessness depending on the leader. Jason wasn't a bad kid, Michael decided. He was angry, lost, and trying to prove something to himself, to his friends, maybe to a world that had already judged him. Michael understood that feeling all too well. He had been judged, too, by the people he fought to protect, by those who saw him as just another cog in a war machine, and by himself. The sound of laughter drew his attention. Across the street, a group of teenagers hung out near a corner store, their chatter punctuated by bursts of laughter. Michael slowed his pace, watching them for a moment. They reminded him of a time when life felt simpler, when the future seemed wide open and untainted by mistakes and regrets. One of the teens glanced his way, their laughter fading as they noticed him. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, a wariness, an unspoken judgment. Michael nodded slightly, not wanting to disturb their peace, and moved on. He passed a mural painted on the side of a building, its vibrant colors stark against the night. It depicted a man and a woman standing together, their hands outstretched as if offering something invisible to the viewer. Beneath it, the words, "Respect is the foundation of change," were written in bold letters. Michael stopped, his gaze lingering on the mural. It was simple, almost cliché, but its message resonated with him. Respect was a choice, one that required effort and understanding. It was easy to lash out, to meet hate with hate. But respect? That required strength. He continued his walk, the mural's message echoing in his mind. He thought about the power of choice, how every action, every word, carried the potential to build or destroy. Jason had chosen destruction tonight, but Michael had chosen something else. He had chosen restraint. The humiliation Jason felt wasn't something Michael took pride in, but it was necessary. Sometimes, a harsh lesson was the only way to cut through the noise of anger and pride. But Michael also knew that humiliation alone wouldn't change Jason. That change had to come from within, from a willingness to see the world differently. As Michael approached his apartment, the weight of the evening pressed down on him. He thought about his own mistakes, the times he had chosen poorly, the people he had hurt along the way. Those choices had shaped him, but they didn't define him. What defined him was what he chose to do afterward. He climbed the steps to his door, pausing before unlocking it. For a moment he stood there, his thoughts swirling. He thought about reaching out to Jason, finding a way to show him a better path. But he knew it wasn't that simple. Change couldn't be forced, it had to be chosen. Finally he stepped inside, the familiar quiet of his apartment greeting him like an old friend. He set his keys on the table and sat down, his mind still restless. The night had been a test, not just of his strength, but of his resolve to be better than his past. Michael leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The world outside was filled with anger, hate, and misunderstanding, but it was also filled with potential. And for every Jason, there was a chance to make a difference, to show that respect wasn't just a word, it was a way of life. The road ahead wasn't easy, but Michael knew it was worth walking. He had seen what happened when people chose hate. Now, he wanted to see what could happen when they chose something better. Michael sat by the window, the early evening casting long shadows across his small apartment. Outside, the city buzzed faintly, a hum of life continuing on. He sipped a cup of coffee, staring at the condensation forming on the glass. Despite his calm exterior, his thoughts churned. He kept replaying the encounter with Jason and his group, dissecting every moment and wondering if his words had made any impact. He had no illusions about changing them overnight. Men like Jason didn't just wake up one day and become different. The anger and pride they carried weren't superficial, they were rooted in deeper insecurities and fears. Michael had seen it countless times before, in the men he'd served with, in the people he'd fought against, and in himself. The memory of Jason's venomous insults and the humiliation in his eyes lingered. Michael hoped, perhaps foolishly, that this meeting could become a turning point. If they saw the futility of their rage and the emptiness of their bravado, maybe they could avoid walking the path of destruction Michael had witnessed so many others take. As the hours passed, the quiet of the apartment began to feel oppressive. Michael stood and grabbed his jacket, deciding to take a walk. The air was brisk, biting at his face as he stepped outside. The streets were quieter now, the city settling into the rhythm of the night. He found himself wandering back toward the spot where the confrontation had occurred. The alley was empty now, its shadows stretching ominously. Michael paused, his eyes scanning the space as memories of the night before replayed vividly in his mind. He wondered if Jason or his friends had returned, if they'd spoken about what had happened, or if they'd simply dismissed it as a loss and moved on. Michael's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of voices nearby. He turned, his gaze locking onto a group gathered near a convenience store. It was Jason, Alex, Trevor, and Zach. They were huddled together, their postures tense, their voices low but agitated. Michael watched from a distance, unnoticed for now. "I'm telling you, man, we can't let it go like this," Jason was saying, his voice laced with frustration. "That guy thinks he's better than us. He thinks he can just lecture us and walk away." Alex shifted uneasily, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe he's right, Jason. Maybe we're going about this all wrong." Jason rounded on him, his eyes blazing. "You're taking his side now? After what he did to us?" "I'm not taking anyone's side," Alex said defensively. "But he didn't hurt us, man. He could've, but he didn't." "Why do you think that is?" "Because he's a coward," Jason spat. "No," Trevor interjected quietly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "He's not a coward. He's something else." Jason threw up his hands in exasperation. "Oh great. Now you're all buying into his crap? That old man humiliated us, and you're just gonna let it slide." "Maybe we should," Zach said softly, his voice barely audible over Jason's ranting. "Maybe we needed to hear what he said." Michael watched silently, his heart heavy. This was their crossroads, he realized. They stood on the precipice of change, teetering between doubling down on their anger or stepping away from it. He debated stepping forward, but something held him back. This was their moment, and they needed to own it. Jason's frustration boiled over, and he slammed a fist against the wall. "You all can do whatever the hell you want. But I'm not letting this go." "What's the point, Jason?" Alex asked, his voice firmer now. "You want to go back and fight him again? And what? Get your ass handed to you a second time?" Jason glared at him, his pride clearly wounded. "You don't get it. It's not about the fight. It's about respect." "No, it's about your ego," Alex shot back. "You can't handle the fact that someone put you in your place." Maybe that's exactly what needed to happen. Jason opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to die in his throat. His fists clenched at his sides, his entire body taut with tension. Michael took a step forward then, the sound of his boots on the pavement drawing their attention. The group turned to face him, their expressions a mix of surprise and wariness. Jason's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening as if bracing for another confrontation. "I wasn't trying to humiliate you," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. "I was trying to stop you from making a mistake you couldn't take back." Jason scoffed, crossing his arms. "Yeah? Well, congratulations. You got what you wanted." Michael shook his head. "This isn't about me, Jason. It's about you. About all of you." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze steady. "You think the world owes you something. But the truth is, no one's going to hand you anything. You've got to work for it. And you've got to respect yourself enough to stop looking for fights where there don't need to be any." Jason laughed bitterly. "Easy for you to say. You've already had your shot at life. You don't know what it's like for us." Michael took a step closer, his voice softening. "You're right. I don't know everything you've been through. But I know anger when I see it. And I know where it leads. I've been there, Jason. And I wouldn't wish that road on anyone." The group was silent, the weight of Michael's words hanging heavily in the air. Even Jason seemed momentarily at a loss for how to respond. Michael continued, his tone earnest. "You've got a choice right now. You can keep going down this path, letting your anger and your pride control you. Or you can let this be the moment you turn it around. It's not too late to be better." Jason looked away, his jaw tightening. Alex, Trevor, and Zach exchanged glances, their expressions conflicted. Finally, Alex stepped forward. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly, his gaze meeting Michael's. "I don't want to end up like, whatever it is you've seen." Michael nodded. "It's not easy to change. But it's worth it." Jason said nothing, his shoulders slumping slightly. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his friends hesitating before following him. Michael watched them go, his heart heavy with both hope and uncertainty. As they disappeared into the night, he stood there for a long moment, the city around him quiet once more. He knew he might never see them again, but he hoped, prayed, that this encounter would stick with them, that it would be the spark they needed to choose a different path. Only time would tell. Michael stood at the edge of the park, where the trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. The air was sharp with the scent of damp leaves, and the faint sound of laughter from a nearby playground drifted through the silence. His encounter with Jason and his friends still weighed heavily on him. Every step of the way home, he had thought about their anger, their words, and the way Jason carried himself like a man trying to prove something to the world, and maybe to himself. Michael knew that Jason's fury wasn't just about him. He had been the unfortunate target of a deeper storm, one that Jason likely didn't fully understand. But storms like that didn't just go away. They either consumed everything in their path or were tamed by someone strong enough to face them. Walking deeper into the park, Michael found a bench near the water fountain. The area was mostly empty, save for a jogger in the distance and an older couple feeding ducks by the pond. Michael sat down and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His mind wandered back to his days in the Marines. There had been a time when he had been like Jason, a powder keg of anger and pride, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. He thought about the moment that had changed him. A fellow Marine, older and wiser, had pulled him aside after a heated argument during training. "You think strength is about shouting the loudest or hitting the hardest?" the man had said, his voice calm but firm. "Real strength is knowing when to walk away. It's having the power to destroy but choosing not to. That's what makes you a man." Those words had stuck with Michael, reshaping the way he saw the world. He had learned that restraint wasn't weakness, it was the ultimate form of strength. And now, sitting on the bench, he hoped Jason and his friends would come to understand the same thing. But doubt gnawed at him. The way Jason had glared at him, the humiliation etched into his face, it was the kind of wound that could fester into something far worse if left unchecked. As the hours passed, Michael found himself walking again, wandering the streets aimlessly. He wasn't ready to go home yet. His feet led him to the convenience store where he had last seen Jason, Alex, Trevor, and Zach. It was quiet now, the neon sign buzzing faintly. Michael leaned against a lamppost, his eyes scanning the street. He didn't know what he was expecting. Maybe he hoped to see the boys again, to gauge if his words had made any impact. Or maybe he just wanted closure, some sign that this wasn't another cycle doomed to repeat itself. A car pulled up to the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Michael tensed instinctively, his body ready for anything. But it was just a young couple getting out, their laughter breaking the stillness. They didn't notice him as they walked into the store. Michael sighed and turned to leave when he heard voices down the block. He recognized them immediately. Jason and his friends were gathered near the corner, their silhouettes illuminated by the glow of a streetlight. Michael stayed in the shadows, watching. Jason was pacing, his hands gesturing wildly as he spoke. Alex leaned against the wall, arms crossed, while Trevor and Zach stood nearby, their expressions uncertain. "I'm not letting it go," Jason was saying, his voice sharp with frustration. "That guy thinks he can just talk down to us, like we're nothing. I'm not gonna let him have the last word." "Jason, come on," Alex said, his tone weary. "What's the point? You want to go back and fight him? For what? To get your ass handed to you again?" Jason stopped pacing and whirled on Alex. "I don't need your commentary, okay? You're the one who folded last night. You're the reason we lost face." "Lost face?" Alex snapped, his voice rising. "We're not in some gang war, Jason. We're just four guys who picked a fight with the wrong dude. And you know what? He had every right to put us in our place." Jason's face darkened, and for a moment, it looked like he might lash out. But then he turned away, running a hand through his hair. "He embarrassed us," Jason muttered, his voice softer now. "He embarrassed me." Trevor spoke up for the first time, his voice quiet but steady. "Maybe that's the point, man. Maybe we needed to be embarrassed. You ever think about that?" Jason didn't respond, his shoulders slumping slightly. Michael stepped out of the shadows then, his presence startling the group. They tensed immediately, Jason's fists clenching as he took a step forward. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jason demanded, his voice brimming with hostility. Michael raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to fight," he said calmly. "I just wanted to see if you'd thought about what I said." Jason laughed bitterly. "Oh, we've thought about it all right. You've been living rent-free in my head since last night." "That's not what I want," Michael said. "I don't want to be your enemy, Jason. I want you to see that there's more to life than proving how tough you are. Jason's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Michael took a step closer, his voice soft but firm. You're angry. I get it. But you got to figure out what you're really angry about. Because fighting strangers on the street isn't going to fix it. It's just going to make it worse. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Alex spoke up. He's right, Jason. You're pissed off at the world, but you're taking it out on the wrong people. Maybe it's time to let it go. Jason looked at Alex, then back at Michael. His expression was a mix of anger, confusion, and something else. Something like defeat. I don't know how to let it go, Jason admitted quietly. Michael nodded. It's not easy. But it starts with a choice. A choice to be better, to walk away from the things that drag you down. Jason looked away, his shoulders slumping further. The weight of his anger seemed to hang off him like a heavy cloak. Think about it, Michael said gently. You've got time to change. Don't waste it. With that, Michael turned and walked away, leaving Jason and his friends to wrestle with their thoughts. He didn't know if his words would stick, but he hoped they would. True strength, Michael knew, wasn't about winning fights. It was about mastering yourself, choosing peace when every instinct screamed for violence. And as he disappeared into the night, he hoped Jason would find that strength before it was too late.